privately, I wrestled with, did I overreact? Did I ruin a relationship? Am I hurting my ministry? I even wrestled with, should I just back down and reverse that decision? Just backpedal a little bit to make things better. Stop! That's what I yelled at my daughter one day. We were in the kitchen, cooking up some mac and cheese, a hot pan sitting on the stove, and, well, we had already told her not to touch it. Of course, if you have kids, especially if it's your first one and they're little, you kind of know how it goes. You tell them not to, and curiosity gets the best of them. And then you turn your back for 1 second. When you turn around, you see that little hand reaching up to the pan. The moment I saw it happening, I yelled, "Stop!" And instantly, she started to cry. Because Daddy had suddenly shouted at her. He was mean and harsh and loud and angry. But in that moment, I wasn't any of that. I was trying to make sure that she wasn't gonna hurt herself. I was trying to protect my daughter. And honestly, when it comes to ministry, especially within leaders, it can feel like that a lot of times. Hey, I'm Josh, and this is Beyond the Numbers. This is a podcast where we have real and raw conversations about what healthy ministry should actually look like. The kind of ministry that is more Christ-like and cares for our people well. And today we're talking about something that most every leader at one point will eventually face, and yet the one thing that very few people actually prepare you for. Making the hard calls. Not like those exciting moments where you see lives changed and transformed. Not standing from the stage with the bright lights in your face. Not going to conferences and being a special speaking guest, but the moments where being a good leader costs you something. The moments that you know you're making the right decision, and yet because of that decision, people are angry with you. Or those moments where it feels like obedience to God and popularity start pulling in opposite directions. And honestly, I think that a lot of ministry culture has drifted into two very unhealthy directions when it comes to making these hard calls. On one side, you have the person that will avoid the hard conversations no matter what. Maybe they're terrified of the fallout, or they don't want to upset people. They don't want criticism, or they don't want leaders turning against them, or students leaving, or whispers about what they're doing. And so because of that, they avoid any type of hard conversation. Then you have the other side, the leaders who almost thrive on conflict, where everything becomes a battle, where every disagreement becomes a war, and where everyone is the enemy. Other Christians, the world, other churches down the street, they are the enemy. And then you have healthy leadership, which lives in neither extreme. And the hard part about ministry is that these aren't just employees. They're not just volunteers or numbers on a spreadsheet. A lot of times when we have to make these hard calls, they're about people that we built relationship with, people that we care about, ones that we've prayed for or laughed with or cried with or maybe watched grow for years, if not decades. It's relationships that are attached to these decisions. There's empathy that's attached to these choices that we've got to make, which is why the hard calls in the ministry sometimes feels so brutal. I remember one situation that I had years ago where I had a leader that stepped into ministry, and at first they weren't even sure that they wanted to be part of student ministry. They were like, I'm never going to make an impact. I don't know if I actually have a good opportunity to pour into these kids. Are they even going to care about me? And yet the minute they stepped in, they absolutely thrived. The students loved them. The leaders connected with them. They were charismatic and relational and engaging. And honestly, from the outside, they were a huge win for my ministry. But that was on the outside. Because over time, some concerns started to surface. The line between being a leader and someone that was just a friend to these students started disappearing. And I'm not talking about like healthy relationships or just joking with them a little bit. I mean, the focus slowly started to shift away from discipleship and into popularity. Their small groups became more about conversations and popular topics than actually dissecting the Word of God that we were speaking about. They started loosening around the standards that they held or the standards that we held to the students. Different things that we laid out within leader agreements started to be ignored. And honestly, it felt like this person had suddenly started caring more about being the cool kid in high school than they did about being the status of a leader pouring out into the students. So we sat down, we talked. We walked through the different concerns. I walked them through the expectations that I had for my leaders, and we reviewed the commitments that they filled out when they first agreed to be part of this ministry. And to their credit, they agreed. They understood the concerns, and we made actionable steps to move forward and to make those changes. But within weeks, nothing changed. The same patterns continued. The same compromises continued to happen. They were still meeting off campus. In fact, they were doing different events that were not church approved, and yet they did it with the moniker of the church. They had the same issues, and they kept on resurfacing over and over again. So eventually I had to make the hard call, and I had to ask them to step down. And what followed was rough. Because students loved this person. Other leaders cared deeply about them. And suddenly, to some people, I became the villain. I was labeled jealous and controlling, ruining the ministry. I didn't care about good leaders. In that season, I even had students that left the ministry that we were running because of this decision. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was fully confident the whole time. Yes, on the outside, publicly, I stayed calm and I stayed firm. But privately, I wrestled with, did I overreact? Did I ruin a relationship? Am I hurting my ministry? I even wrestled with, should I just back down and reverse that decision? Just backpedal a little bit to make things better. Now, here's the thing. Without going into every detail about what was happening, there were genuinely compromises and sin that was happening here. This wasn't a little petty power struggle. There were wrong things that were happening that needed to be addressed. And I did, but it didn't make it easy. Leadership doesn't always feel rewarding when you have to make those hard calls. Sometimes obedience costs approval. And I think that's why so many leaders avoid these moments within their ministries entirely. So how do we as leaders, as volunteers, how do we handle the hard calls in a healthier way within our ministries? I think the first thing is to set up guardrails before you ever need them. I spent about 6.5 years in Los Angeles, and you'd drive through the mountain passes and you'd hit certain areas, not all of them, but certain areas would have guardrails along the edges so that you didn't plummet off the cliff. Now, they didn't put the guardrails hoping that someone is really going to test out those guardrails, hoping that people will consistently bounce off of it. Their hope with putting up those guardrails is that they will never need to be used. They're protections that they hope will never be tested. And when it comes to the ministry, it's important for us to set up guardrails, not in hopes that people can keep on bouncing off of them, in hopes that we never have to use them. But if we do, they're there to protect us and to protect the integrity of our ministry. For me, that's why I believe clear expectations matter when it comes to having different ministry standards and getting volunteers. I do that through leadership commitments. setting up codes of conduct or clear standards and expectations when it comes to what we want our leaders to do, what we want our discipleship process and those expectations to look like. And we do those things not because we're trying to control people, not because we're trying to remain in power, but because it helps clarify everything for people that are stepping into the ministry. And it also makes those hard conversations a little less emotional and a lot more honest. Instead of a leader saying, well, I didn't know that we weren't supposed to do that, I can point back to the beginning and be like, this is the code of conduct that you signed. These were the expectations that we agreed to together. And sometimes those lists and those conversations on the very first try, they work. Sometimes people genuinely respond to those things and grow when they're redirected. But when they don't, it's those guardrails that help guide the next steps and how we deal with this with integrity. The second thing is to remember that discipline should be aimed towards restoration, not humiliation. This is a very incredible, important point. Do you see the emphasis I'm putting on this? Because hard calls should never become about revenge. The goal should never be, how can I embarrass this person? Instead, the goal should always be, how do I protect people while also leaving room for restoration? That's exactly when we look in scriptures what we see. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing a situation involving open sin within the church. And he tells the church that they cannot continue to ignore and pretend like everything's fine. And so they have to address the sin and address the people dealing with it. And later in 2 Corinthians, after repentance and after correction, Paul encourages restoration and comfort to the people that were involved so that they're not overwhelmed with sorrow. That matters. Biblical accountability is not about destroying people. If anything, biblical accountability is really about protecting the body and pursuing restoration. Now, I also realize when it comes to the restoration, sometimes people think, well, because I was a leader, now I'm being restored into my leadership role. And the truth is, depending on the levels of infraction or sin, those are things that can't happen. So because of that, there is a restoration back to the church and the community, but that doesn't mean that the restoration is you receiving the role that you had to step down from, or in some cases that you were kicked out of. The third thing, be careful not to let self-protection turn into gossip. This one's a hard one because when people misunderstand our decisions, in the case with those people that were upset with me for mine, our natural instinct becomes to defend ourselves. We want to explain every detail that went into the choices that we made, every motivation for why we made those choices. And sometimes we even try to pull some behind the scenes issues into it to give them an understanding. We start building our defense case. And sometimes there is clarification that needs to happen. Sometimes clarification is necessary. But if we're not careful, we start oversharing. We start giving information that isn't needed simply to protect what we feel like our reputation that's coming under attack. And suddenly we go from protecting to drifting into gossip and slander and into humiliation. Not everything needs to be publicly explained in full detail just so we can feel vindicated. Sometimes as leaders, integrity means carrying misunderstanding quietly. And fourth, remember whose you are. We've discussed this so many times on this podcast. But before you are a pastor, before you're a leader, before you were the cool leader that everyone liked, you belong to God. You're his son or his daughter. Your identity cannot rest on applause or approval or popularity or whether everyone agrees with every one of your decisions. Because if you're honest with yourself, if your identity is being built on being liked, hard leadership moments will absolutely crush you. As I was going through the process of writing out this episode and scripting it out, one of the sections of scripture that kept on coming to me was the story of Gideon. And he's being sent out to battle the Midianites. And they're already wildly outnumbered. And I can only imagine what it's like trying to build the morale of men when you know that you are facing really difficult odds. But in Judges 7, starting in verse 2, it says this: "The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home.' So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 that were willing to fight." That would be heartbreaking as a leader. Losing out on that many people. Forget just the battle. Imagine walking into church being like, whoever would like to leave because the Bible's too hard, you can go. And your congregation drops down from like 22,000 from 32,000 to 10,000. You'd have some explaining to do. But God's not done there yet. Because then in verse 4 it says, "But the Lord told Gideon, 'There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not.' When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, 'Divide the men into 2 groups. In one group, put all of those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all of those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream.' Only 300 men drank from their hands. All the others get down on their knees and drink with their mouths from the stream. The Lord told Gideon, 'With these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you the victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home.'" I don't know what kind of leader you are, but in a span of, who knows, a week, a day, going from 32,000 men and impossible odds down to 300 with different leadership decisions. Man, those are some hard, difficult conversations just to keep the morale up. You got to wonder if some of those guys were like, "Dude, what are you thinking? Why are you letting this happen? We are going to get decimated. What decisions are you making?" They were probably ready to vote Gideon out. And yet God kept on stripping the numbers down more and more because he wanted dependence on him, not confidence in the numbers. And honestly, ministry at times can feel like that too. Sometimes obedience doesn't immediately grow the room. Sometimes making the right calls cost attendance, cost influence, or even approval. But healthy ministry was never supposed to be built purely on numbers anyway. And maybe some of you are listening right now, and you're in the middle of one of these seasons. Maybe you've had to make the hard calls recently, and you know what it's like to have people walk away because of it, or be misunderstood. Or maybe you're carrying the weight of criticism right now as you watch this. Let me encourage you, if you're in the midst of this, not every hard call is biblical. Sometimes leaders absolutely abuse authority. Sometimes leaders hide behind hard truths while acting harsh, prideful, or unloving. But sometimes love requires courage. Sometimes protecting people requires super uncomfortable conversations. And sometimes shepherding means stepping between people and danger, even if they don't understand it in the moment. And if you're trying to lead faithfully, humbly, prayerfully. And most importantly, if you're trying to live and lead biblically, don't let a temporary backlash pull you away from the obedience that we need to make sure that we are giving to God. Because leadership isn't about protecting your image. It's about serving Christ faithfully. So let me ask you this. What's a hard leadership lesson that you've had to learn over the years? Maybe you've experienced something like what we talked about today. Maybe there's a different leadership lesson that you learned along the way that you're like, man, people need to hear this. Or maybe what's one thing you want to make sure that you never compromise within your leadership? Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely think that these are conversations that the church needs to have more openly. And hopefully, if this episode encouraged you or challenged you, or maybe you're in the midst of the process and it helped you carry on a little bit longer, then share it with another leader. Subscribe and continue to follow so that we can continue to have these conversations. And next week, we're talking about something that honestly, well, it can be a bit harder. And that is those moments where you want to lead forward, but God is telling you to wait just a little bit longer. Where our dreams, ambition, and vision are surpassing God, and we have to slow down a little bit. It'll be a unique and interesting conversation that I hope you guys join us for. Until then, I'm Josh, and this is Beyond the Numbers. Let's continue to work together to make sure that our ministries are growing healthier and more Christ-like as we work to grow beyond the numbers. Thanks.